You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Okay, well, welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. As I say pretty much every time, I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours. So this is the, for lack of a better term, the big one this week, because I'm going to put this out probably on Friday or Saturday, and then just a couple days later is the election. So now, you've already had, if you've been listening, you've already had like 8-9 hours of content of me talking with other people about their political philosophy. And now I'm going to go ahead and tell you what I think the government should and should not be doing, what my theory of government is, what I think about all the various problems that arise with the democratic process, voting, representative democracy, those kind of things, and how I think you should vote in this upcoming election. Now, I've actually got a little bit of a problem here in that what I typically do when I'm giving you my ideas on any kind of subject is I just come right out and tell you my conclusion, give you a little summary of my reasoning, and then go into the details. But here's the problem, which is that politics has now become so incredibly divisive that if I tell you my conclusion right from the get-go, I'm probably going to lose somewhere between 50 and 80% of you, assuming the people who listen to this podcast fit the general demographic of the United States, that is. If I tell you to go vote for President Trump because Biden's an old man who's never really done anything, probably is starting to, unfortunately, lose his mind and has kowtowed to the extreme political left, well, then I'm going to lose pretty much everybody who's a Democrat or everybody who's repulsed by Trump. If I tell you to go vote for Biden because President Trump is a raging narcissist who says incredibly stupid things, well, then I'll probably lose pretty much everybody who's a conservative who wants to go vote for Trump. And if I tell you to go vote for a third-party candidate, I'll probably lose 90% of you right from the get-go because if statistics are believed to be true, 90% of you have bought the lie that you have to vote for a Democrat or a Republican or you're throwing away your vote. So, I'm going to do something I don't normally do in my podcast, and that is, I'm going to bury the lead. I'm going to make you wait until the end of the podcast before I tell you what exactly I think you should do. But I will make this caveat. If now or at the end of the podcast or at any point, you are genuinely convinced that Donald Trump would be a better president than Joe Biden, that's who you should vote for. If you're genuinely convinced that Joe Biden would be a better president than Donald Trump, that's who you should vote for. And if you are convinced that one of the third-party candidates, like Joe Jurgensen or the Unity Party nominated Tulsi Gabbard and Dan Crenshaw, if you're convinced any of them would be a better president, that's who you should actually go vote for. You should vote for who you think is going to do the better job, regardless of what I or anyone else tell you. Now, having said that, if you are so utterly convinced of your position, i.e. voting for Biden against Trump for Biden or something like that, if you're so utterly convinced of that you can't even imagine anything would change your mind, well, that's a problem, because that probably means that you're being irrationally closed-minded. And what I mean by that is, it's not irrational to be closed-minded about the idea that, say, the Earth is a sphere-like shape that is in space. There's a great deal of evidence that supports that, and if somebody comes to you and says, oh, the world is flat, it's not irrational to just reject that out of hand. But when it comes to something as complicated as American politics, where there's multiple lines of evidence that have to be weighed and calculated in all kinds of different manners, where this issue may be important but may not be as important as this issue, and every politician we could possibly vote for is an absolute mess, well, in that situation, if you're so utterly convinced of who you want to vote for that you can't think of anything that would change your mind, I'd say you're being irrationally closed-minded. If it makes you angry when you hear that this person is voting for Biden or this person is voting for Trump, that's irrational. That's probably a sign that you have some emotional issues and you're investing way too much of your life and emotional energy into politics. So, just as a thought experiment, if what I'm saying sounds like it describes you, honestly sit down and think about, what if I'm wrong? What if this other person would be a better president? What would that look like? What kind of evidence would that produce? What kind of policy decisions would lead in that regard? And go look for that. And it really doesn't matter, for what I'm saying here, whether or not you change your mind. What matters is that you actually do the exercise of considering, what if I'm wrong? Because, again, if you look at statistics, I'd say that probably the vast majority of people in America, when it comes to politics, never do that. And so you should genuinely sit down, if you're going to vote, and you're convinced of who you're going to vote for, you should sit down and think about, well, what if I'm wrong? And play out that thought experiment, because even if it doesn't change your mind, that's a very virtuous thing to do, both intellectually and in the moral virtues. Considering whether or not you're wrong is really one of the best things you can do if you want to be a good, humble thinker and a good, virtuous person. Now, transitioning into what my theory of government is, the primary reason why it really shouldn't get you very angry and you really shouldn't put a whole lot of emotional investment into it if, say, your neighbor's voting for the candidate that you don't like, say you're supporting Biden and they're supporting Trump, or I know it's happening even in households that like husbands and wives are voting for different people and things along those lines. The reason why you shouldn't let it get you so angry that it breaks relationships and stuff like that is because the odds that that person's vote is actually going to make a difference getting that person that you don't like into office is so astronomically low that you can just write it off. It's not going to make a difference. The odds that it's going to make a difference are so minuscule. So it's perfectly rational to get angry and upset with people and emotionally invest yourself in things that are actually going to affect your life. Emotionally invest yourself in your kids and your family. You can emotionally invest yourself to a lesser degree in like the house or the apartment or the place you live. It affects your life. You can emotionally invest yourself even in hobbies and other activities that you enjoy. And if somebody's coming along and, say, threatening those things that you enjoy, like, say, you enjoy playing video games like me, and a politician is saying, well, I want to ban video games. They're unhealthy, which in some circumstances they certainly are. Well, it's perfectly appropriate for you to at least get a little bit upset because what that person wants to do is going to affect your life. However, suppose a friend of yours is voting for that politician and it's a statewide election, say this is for Senate, and you live in a state where there's like 15 million people. Well, if about half the population votes, there'll be about 7.5 million votes. What are the odds that your friend who's voting for that politician who's going to take away your right to play video games, what are the odds that his vote's actually going to make a difference as far as that's what's going to put that politician over the edge and thereby take away your right to play video games? Really, 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 really low. Hence, even if it's something that you're invested in, it's not really worth your emotional time and investment in the sense that your friend is making that wrong vote as you see it. And now this problem is further diluted by the fact that in the U.S. government, it's not the case that politicians get to do just whatever the crap they want. There's checks and balances in the system. In that case, that senator would have to propose a bill. The bill would have to make it out of a committee. Then the whole Senate would have to vote on it. Then the House would have to pass it. Then the president would have to sign it. So even if that politician gets to that Senate seat and wants to do that, he might actually be thwarted by other things in the process. And it's even more compounded when you look at how the presidential election goes, because the Electoral College is what actually elects the president, and as a result of that, the election usually comes down to a couple of different swing states, like usually Pennsylvania, Florida, Ohio, I think they're saying Arizona, Michigan, and possibly Minnesota this time. And those tend to change and fluctuate every election cycle. Missouri used to be considered a swing state until about 8 years ago, and now it's broken pretty consistently for the Republicans since, I want to say, 2008, so about 12 years ago. So the swing states change, and so the point being, even if you really, really do want to grant that one of the parties, one of the candidates, is an existential crisis, and if they get in, everything's just going to go to absolute hell and the country's going to fall apart, which you're almost certainly wrong about. But even if I grant you that, you still should not get angry and emotionally invested in the fact that your friend is voting for the wrong person. Because the actual amount of power, the actual practical effect that your friend's vote has in making that happen is so minuscule that you might as well not even worry about it. Even if you can talk your friend out of that position and into yours, still doesn't make a very big effect. Now, as a consequence of that, one of the reasons why I'm doing a political podcast like this is if I get this out to even only 50 people, I've probably affected the election far, far more than my actual voting has. But again, all of this to say, if when you're walking around the neighborhood and you see a Trump-Pence sign or a Biden-Harris sign and it starts to make your blood boil, that's irrational. You need to stop that. And whatever you got to do to stop that, that's fine. It's probably a large reflection of the fact that the media is constantly hyping negative politics. Human beings naturally have tribalistic tendencies where we try to demonize the other and excuse the errors and problems of our in-crowd, and many, many of those other things. But that's an irrational anger. Now, if somebody's coming along threatening your children, your house, and your way of life, and there's actually a substantial chance that they're going to do something, then it's rational to get angry about it. This is why if a 5-year-old is angry at you and starts yelling, "I'm going to kill you," it's not rational to get angry about it. In fact, usually a better reaction would be to kind of laugh in his face because a 5-year-old can't do that, and you recognize that. Well, in the case of politics, voters disagreeing, they're typically a lot like that 5-year-old. It's not going to make much of a difference. Now, tying into that, you hear both sides of the political aisle, both the Democrats and the Republicans, and to some extent, this even happens with the Libertarians and the third party people, essentially saying every time, this election is an existential crisis. If we don't get this right, everything's going to fall apart. And if you've been listening to my political podcasts up to this point, you know that I put that question to everybody. And for the most part, I really don't think that they all kind of bought into my claim that that's just garbage. If I remember correctly, Pat kind of agreed with me and then downplayed it a little bit and said that he thinks the Democrats really are an existential crisis this time. And if I'm misquoting you, Pat, I apologize. That was about a month or two ago. And Jonathan more or less kind of said the same thing. And Dustin agreed with me that when the two parties have claimed that in the past, that that's not true, but said, but there's evidence that President Trump is an existential crisis this time. Well, I respect all those guys for coming on and talking to me, and I'm very grateful for that, but I don't think Dustin's right about that. I don't see evidence that President Trump is in an existential crisis that's going to end the whole country if he gets reelected. He's been president for 4 years. The country's still here. I do think when he was running the first time, you had some evidence and some warrant for thinking that, because he was saying at the time things like, I'm going to order our troops to commit war crimes. Well, that's a big problem, and I think you would have been warranted in voting against him if you voted against him for that reason. But as best as I can tell, he hasn't turned around and ordered our troops to commit war crimes, at least certainly not more so than any other president before him has. And so my point being, when you hear the political parties and the media telling you, this is an existential crisis, we have to get this one right, it's the most important election of your lifetime, that's a lie. At best, it's hyperbolic rhetoric. It's not true. It hasn't been true in America for a long, long, long time. You can maybe make a case that that was the case during the Civil War, or during the Great Depression, or during World War II, or in some other cases like that. It's not to say that it's not important and that we don't want the right people to get in there, but whether or not Donald Trump or Joe Biden wins the election, come January when they're sworn in, you're still going to be in America, you're still going to have your basic rights, and you're still going to be able to go to your job, do your hobbies, and for the most part, live your life. That's not to say you can't make an argument that one's going to be better or one's going to be worse or something along those lines. Clearly, one has to be better and one has to be worse. But it's not an existential crisis. And so that's another reason, again, why you shouldn't be so angry and hyper-invested in politics and getting and breaking relationships with people over this. Because even if they're wrong, even if they vote for the wrong guy, it's not going to be to end everything. I put this to my conservative friends by saying, look, President Obama was president for 8 years. I voted against him both times. I didn't like his policies. I don't think he was a good president. But with the possible exception of the individual mandate in his healthcare bill, I still have all the same basic rights as an American citizen that I had when he entered office and when he left office. And that's a minor exception. And at the same time, when President Trump was elected, you heard lots of rhetoric from people on the left who were scared to death that he was going to take away rights from women, that he was going to take away rights from minorities, that he was going to take away rights from gay and lesbian people, and on you go. It hasn't happened, because this is America, and your rights are not dependent on who's president. Your rights are dependent on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and any president who tried to do something against that would probably find himself forced out of office because the military, the Secret Service, and all branches swear a loyalty oath not to the president, but to the U.S. Constitution. So, don't believe the lie that this is an existential crisis. It's not. I know it's very, very hard to not believe that lie if you're watching the media, because both sides hammer their fist on the table and say, it's all going to end if you don't do the right thing. But they've been saying that for at least 20 years, at least since I've been aware of politics. They've said that every single election cycle, and every single time it's been wrong. It's not true. It's not an existential crisis. So, with those preliminaries out of the way, let me move on into what my theory of government is. That is, what I think the government should and should not be doing. I call myself a libertarian with a small l. John called himself kind of a libertarian with a capital L, although anarcho-capitalism, it basically is libertarianism with a capital L. That's a kind of a loose way of speaking about it. But essentially my idea is founded on the idea that the government that governs least governs best. And I'm only here talking about American systems of government, because you could actually make a case that if you had a totalitarian government that was run by one dictator who was fiercely benevolent and only cared about his people and was fiercely selfless, that then the government that governs least governs best would be a bad principle, because things would work very, very well under such a person. But to the best of my knowledge, no dictator has actually ever been that way. There's probably never going to be a human being who could be trusted with that level of power. So, practical effect, when you're looking at a government that's supposed to be of the people, by the people, and for the people, that's a democracy or some type of representative government, like what we have, then the government that governs least governs best. And what I mean by that is, in as much as it's possible for it to do so, the government should leave you alone to live your own life and do things as you see fit. And where it should step in, it should only do that when it can demonstrate a clear causal connection between what you're doing and how it's going to harm your neighbors. And by clear causal connection, I mean it can't be a potential harm that's like several steps down the road. It can't be a harm that's implied or something along those lines. So there are obvious clear examples in where the government can step in if you intend to murder somebody, because that's a clear harm. You can extend that out to the government stepping in and putting speed limits on roads, because if there aren't some traffic laws, including speed limits, that's very, very harmful to everyone. There has to be some type of agreed upon standard as to how we drive and get around on roads, and it's very convenient and easy for the government, whether the feds, the state, or local governments, to step in and establish something along those lines. It should not be the case that the government steps in to protect you from your own bad choices. Here's a good, easy example of that. I used to live in Springfield, Missouri, and at the time I was living in Springfield, Missouri, I really enjoyed smoking cigars. They'd have a art walk in the downtown area on Friday nights sometimes, and I would go smoke a cigar and walk around and look at the art. It was pretty fun. I've since given up smoking cigars because they're bad for me. Well, while I was still living there, Springfield passed a smoking ban, which essentially said you cannot smoke in public places, with a few exceptions for businesses that were grandfathered in. Actually, they passed that a little later, because there were some businesses that had already allowed smoking and kind of depended upon it. Like there's a cigar lounge on the south side, which quite clearly couldn't exist if smoking was banned in all public places. So anyhow, I looked at that and said, no, this is wrong. Yes, smoking is harmful for you, whether it's cigarettes, pipe tobacco, or cigars, whatever. I mean, I've enjoyed it, but it is harmful for me. But I'm harming myself, not other people, by doing that. And this is especially, you could make a case that if like somebody had severe asthma or something along those lines, that they might pick up some secondhand smoke from me walking around outside smoking the cigar. But that's a little unlikely, especially unless I was being rude. Like, if somebody asked me when I was walking by if I could cross the side of the street because they had asthma or something and the cigar smoke might hurt them, I would certainly have complied with that. And in effect, what actually happened is a lot of the bars now said, we can't have you smoking inside, so there's a designated smoking area outside, which in turn happened to be right near the door that you took to get into the bar, which meant more people were actually being exposed to secondhand smoke because government bans typically cause all kind of unintended consequences and often shoot themselves in the foot and undermine themselves, and that's what happened there. But all that to say, I look at that ban and go, no, that's wrong. You're only harming yourself by smoking, so the government has no right to step in and say, no, you can't do that. And it's the same thing with a lot of things that the government wants to ban. If you're only harming yourself, well, it's stupid, and I wish you wouldn't do that, but you should have the right to harm yourself and no other person as far as the legality and the politics go. I'm not claiming that's morally right. It's morally wrong that you would do many of those kind of things because it's going to be damaging to your own life. It's going to be damaging to the lives of your family and friends. But it's not the kind of thing that the state should be able to step in and tell you, no, you can't do that. A great example of this, which was decided politically a while ago now, is gay marriage. I'm quite convinced that gay marriage is a very bad idea and is immoral. However, you can't easily demonstrate a causal connection between two gay people getting married and any harm that's going to be brought on me and my family. I think there probably are long-term consequences and harm that's going to be brought to society by that happening, and I think in time that'll probably be borne out. However, there's not a clear, obvious causal connection between I have two gay neighbors who are living together and married and harm that's going to come to me, my family, and society. Hence, the government shouldn't have the right to step in and tell those two gay people, no, you can't do that, because there isn't a clear causal connection. And I know that's going to probably alienate some of my conservative listeners when I say that, but that's just the way that I view political authority is, unless there is a clear, obvious causal connection between harm that you're doing to society or other people, then the government can't step in and tell you no. And this is where I, in many senses, part company from Pat Flynn's Common Good Conservative, because he thinks, for the most part, at least as I understood him, that the government does have the right to step in and promote those things. Now, I think he would probably say it should do it in more positive ways than saying, no, you can't do that. It should, make taxes where it incentivizes the nuclear family and things along those lines. It should promote, as he talked about with me, virtues in education and educating people to make them more patriotic and more virtuous so we have a better, more moral society filled with better and more moral people. And I just genuinely don't see how the government can or should do that, because it's not the government's place. The government only exists, under my theory, to provide a sense of stability and order so people can live together. And as a consequence of that, if it's like your local government and you live in an area that's not very diverse, you're probably going to have the government stepping in and doing a lot more things there that people will agree upon. I think an example I talked with one of them about is how in Arkansas, when I was there for some work I was doing, alcohol sales were far, far more restricted than they were in Missouri. Now, if the vast majority of people in Arkansas agree with that, hey, that's perfectly fine. The problem comes in that U.S. society is extremely diverse, both ethnically, religiously, philosophically, pretty much every kind of category you can think of. It's incredibly diverse. And so then the only way you can have a government that is even close to attempting to be fair is to have it attempt to stand back as far as it can go and say, I'm only going to step in as a last resort. Now, quite clearly, the U.S. government does not do that. It steps in all the time. Every place it can even find the slightest excuse, it jumps right in and tries to assume control. But that's exactly what I'm saying it should not do. And the reason I'm saying it should not do that is our government has proven time and time again that it's for the most part just radically incapable of actually promoting the common good, of actually preventing catastrophes and things like that. Our government is not competent, and anybody who says it is and it's capable of doing things is just not paying attention and not watching the news. When Joe Biden tells you the government's going to come in and fix your problems, even if he really believes that, no, it won't. It might be able to slightly affect some things, but it's probably going to create more problems in the long run. I forget exactly, but I read of something a while back that problem in where the water's been poisoned in Flint, Michigan, that's still going on, even now. The U.S. government is, for the most part, ineffective, inefficient, and grossly incompetent. And you can see that in every response it has to disasters. Yeah, it gets some food, it can get some food and water to places at times and help some people out. And it's better that that's there than nothing. But more often than not, it mucks things up and does it very badly. So I'm going to be referring to some research I did for an essay I wrote way back in late 2017, early 2018. I did a whole podcast on this essay way back on episode 11, and I'm using this just because I've already done the research on it, so it's easy. And if you want to really dig into the details, go back and listen to episode 11. But the gist of it is, when you look at the government's war on poverty programs, its public aid programs, it spent an enormous amount of money and seen very little return. And this is a point I made to Dustin, but he attempted to counter by saying, well, look, it's done something, and I'm not sure if he didn't quite follow when I said, I grant you that it's done something, but it hasn't really done enough, and we have all these unintended consequences that arise from it. So I'm not sure if he didn't follow me there or if the conversation just moved on. But for the most part, this is, I think, very emblematic of how our government, for the most part, does not work. So, as of 2016, when I was doing this research, the U.S. government had spent somewhere between $20 and $22 trillion in public aid programs since 1964, when President Johnson started his war on poverty. That doesn't include anything that was spent on, say, Social Security and similar programs before. This is only as of 1964 to 2016. And obviously that number will have changed a bit since it's no longer 2016, but that's the best data that was available when I was doing the research on this essay about 2 years ago. So, a lot of money has been spent. $20 to $22 trillion, give or take a bit, is way more the money than most of us can even honestly comprehend. So to help give you some context for how much money that actually is, the U.S. has only spent an estimated $9.3 trillion in every war in the nation's history as of 2016. Now, I arrived at that number, which is adjusted for inflation, by combining two sources. The first is a congressional report, which was adjusted for inflation, that lists the costs of U.S. wars that came out in 2010. And the second is a study that was put out by some people at Brown University on U.S. budgetary costs of U.S. wars through 2016. And so basically I just took those numbers and tried to realistically and honestly add them together, and you come up with about $9.3 trillion as the total cost for every war in the United States history. Which means in the 52 years from 1964 to 2016, the U.S. spent well more than twice as much money on public aid programs than it did for every single war in its history. Which is really quite astonishing, because public perception is very much the other way around. You'll often hear people exclaiming, well, if we can fund all these wars and military adventures, why aren't we paying for healthcare and for poverty programs for our own people and things along those lines? But when you look at the actual data for where the U.S. government spends its money, approximately, again as of 2016, 2/3 of its budget was for public aid programs, and the vast majority of the rest was taken up by military programs. But the point being, the U.S. government spends the vast majority of its money on public aid programs. And we don't really seem to see much effect on that. The poverty level dropped a little bit initially after President Johnson initiated his war on poverty, but it had also been going down before he did that. And then it more or less stayed kind of stagnant. I mean, it's gone up and down a little bit, but it hasn't gone up and down significantly since these massive aid expenditures came into place. Although, who knows, with the coronavirus now throwing everything out of whack, that's totally unprecedented. That might skyrocket the poverty rate when the details and numbers for this year come out. But at the same time, the government has again spent an enormous amount of money on public aid in the past year or so to try to offset those effects. And so the point I'm driving at here is, $20 trillion, that's such a big number that you might have a hard time comprehending it. So I used the comparison of the actual amount of money the U.S. has spent in all of its wars to give you some comparison. The U.S. has spent, well, again, more than twice as much money in just 52 years on public aid programs as it has spent on all the armed conflicts it's been in the nation's history, at least as of 2016. I'm sure the numbers would be at least a little bit different if I ran it again, but I really don't think it would have changed substantially in only 3 or 4 years. So, in effect, what this means is, say, back in 1964, rather than creating all these public aid programs, President Johnson had just created a future trust fund to literally throw money at the problem. Well, statistically speaking and mathematically speaking, that would actually be better, because as of 2016, when I did these calculations, there was an estimated 40.6 million people in poverty. At the same time, the average threshold of poverty for that same year, and because that varies from place to place, you need more money to get by in New York than you do in a rural area like where I live. Well, the average threshold was $12,228 for a single person. So, just working off averages to make it a little simpler here, by its own definitions, all the government would have needed to do to completely eliminate poverty, mathematically, in 2016 was to give everyone in poverty at least $12,229. Some people probably made $6,000, so that would put them way above the limit. But at the very least, everybody getting that much should have knocked out poverty. And again, I'm simplifying a little bit for the thought experiment. Well, if the U.S. government had done that in 2016, it would have costed $496.4 billion, which is considerably less than the federal budget. But again, this would have only been for a single year, so let's be a little bit more generous and say we want to do this for 20 years, and instead of $12,229, we'll just send everyone an even $20,000. That would only cost $16.2 trillion. Not cheap, but far less than the 20-some-odd trillion dollars that have been spent already. And now there are obvious limitations to this thought experiment. It doesn't account for changing variables such as the fluctuations in the poverty rate. It doesn't account for the fact that in households that have multiple people that are below the poverty rate, they'd be getting far more money than they need to just rise out of poverty. It also doesn't account for the what should be obvious fact to anybody who's looked into issues surrounding poverty, that you really just can't throw money at the problem and make it go away. There's societal issues involved. There's systemic issues involved. There's issues about how people do and don't know how to manage money and things along those lines that are involved. There's issues about whether or not people actually have access to work and investment opportunities, and on and on and on you go. Simply throwing money at it isn't going to make poverty go away, in reality. But statistically and mathematically, what this demonstrates is that the government is so inefficient and so bad at these public aid programs that it is literally wasting money, because at this point, if it just nixed all these programs, identified the people who are in poverty, and started giving them money, that would do a better job of eliminating these problems. That would have more impact. But it can't do that. The basic math of how much the government spends shows us that it is actually spending more money to rise people out of poverty than it needs to, as if it just literally turned around and started handing out money free for all. And now this begs the question, well, why? Why is the government so bad at doing this? And there's many details and things that we can get into with that. In fact, if you're curious, I encourage you to go back and listen to episode 11. I lay out multiple problems and things that arise with this, both in the structure of our government and in societal structures and so on and so forth. But I think the main reason is a problem of complexity. Now, there's a principle that any engineer will teach you that the more moving parts something has, the more components something has, the more chances it has to break. That's one of the reasons why in computers you're seeing a move to solid-state drives. There's not moving parts, it's less likely to break, less likely to wear out, hence that's better. Not to mention they're also faster, and that's probably the main reason. But the military has also experimented with weapons that have less moving parts, like rifles that are essentially solid-state rifles except for the bullets and things along those lines, because then it's almost impossible for like a solid-state rifle to jam because there aren't mechanisms that could get gummed up. And so just as a general principle, the more parts something has, the more components it has, the more places there are for it to go wrong, the more chances is for something to go wrong. And you can apply that principle to theories, to political philosophy, to programs, to institutions, to anything. The more components something has, the more likely it is that something's going to go wrong. Part of the reason why conspiracy theories are almost always wrong is as soon as you involve 100 people in a conspiracy, something's going to go wrong. You can't involve that many people without something happening that you didn't plan for, because it's now big and complicated. And U.S. public aid programs and government aid programs are extraordinarily and extremely complicated. Now, there's some evidence that some people have pointed to that suggests that when those programs were initially put in place, they actually did help people considerably, that we were getting efficient bang for our buck, so to speak. But then eventually that stopped, and they started actually causing more problems than they solved. And a large part of the reason for that, what I'm arguing, is that those programs started getting more complicated, they started getting more bureaucrats, they started getting more levels, more committees, more hands looking in saying, well, how do we make sure this money is being distributed fairly? They had more senators, more congressmen and running oversights, they had more institutions involved at the federal level, the state level, the local level, and on you go. And eventually it got so complicated that no one could ever figure out how to make it work because it just got way, way, way too big. So another way to explain this basic principle is, and I think I did attempt to touch on this when I was talking to Dustin, but suppose I've got a friend, and I don't know, call him Tom for this example, and Tom needs money to help pay his rent, and just because it's easy, we'll say he needs $100, even though I don't think there's any place in the country where you can rent a decent place for $100, but just for the example, say it's $100. And I turn around and start helping Tom by giving him $100. Well, that's great, and that could help him out considerably in many, many ways. And there's other details, again, that we can get into about the fact that as the amount of money you give him goes up, the actual value, that is the amount of practical value the money gives him, goes down. $100 isn't worth very much to a billionaire, but it's worth a whole lot to somebody who doesn't have any money until you give them that $100. The more wealth and resources you have, the less value each actual dollar actually has because it doesn't have as great an effect on your life. But anyhow, suppose while I'm giving Tom $100 to help him meet his rent, I observe like there's some problems going on. Like maybe Tom stopped looking for work. Maybe he tells me he doesn't want to look for work. He just wants me to keep giving him the money. Maybe I think he's being lazy. Well, if it's just me giving Tom $100, there's all kinds of ways I can deal with that. I could go talk to him about the problem. I could set up some parameters, say, hey man, you got to go look for a job at least once a day, and then I'll keep giving you the money because you got to try at least. I'm going to help you out, but you got to try to do something. Or conversely, maybe it's the case that he genuinely can't look for work for some reason. Maybe he was in a car accident and is laid up for months. Maybe he has a very serious injury where he needs to be medically retired, but I can afford to keep giving him $100 for the rest of his life, and that's something I should do to help out my fellow man. The point being, if it's just Tom and me, any one of those scenarios can come up, and I can probably deal with it. And as long as I'm a decent, virtuous person, I can probably deal with it in a way that's good for Tom and good for me, because I have that interpersonal relationship with him, so I can figure it out. He and I can figure it out together. Now, if you increase the complexity of this and make it, say, me doing this for 5 people, and even vary the amount of money I'm giving them, I could probably still do that for 5 people. I'm not exactly the most sociable person in the world, but I could maintain interpersonal relationships where I'm reasonably aware of what's going on with 5 people. But increase that to 500, and I couldn't do it anymore. There's no way I would be able to keep track of everything. It's very likely some people would dupe me into giving them money when they're being lazy and they don't deserve it. It's very likely that I would make mistakes and say to people who genuinely need my aid, no, I think you're being lazy, or you don't deserve it for some other reason, or you're wasting it, so I'm not going to give it to you. I would start making mistakes if I was distributing money and aid to 500 people, because I can't keep track of that. I'm only one human man after all. Now, this problem is that there's simply no way for any single person, organization, or institution to avoid all the severe problems and unintended consequences that are going to arise when you have a system that is so complex that it's giving out about $2.47 trillion to over 100 million people, which is what USAID public programs did in 2016. Again, that's when I did the research on this. I bet you God could figure out how to do that, but no human person or institution or any organization or institution that's run by human people can do that. It's just way, way too big and too complicated. And this, I think, is the problem with the U.S. government that, with all respect to them, guys like Pat and Dustin just don't seem to get. It's too big and too complicated to work much of the time. There are a few exceptions where it does seem to manage to accomplish some things, at least not disastrously so. But for the most part, most government programs, most government institutions, most government agencies tend to cause at least as many problems as they solve, and often cause more problems, and tend to be very ineffective, very inefficient, and very wasteful. The government is really very, very bad at doing things. I know I mentioned it sometime in the past couple of weeks, but how ridiculous is it that you have agencies within the executive branch that fight each other, like the FBI and the CIA will fight each other for turf and for intelligence and things along those lines. And that was one of the problems that actually caused or led to 9/11, where the hijackers were able to slip through all these things because there were interagency fights within the executive branch. Well, both of those agencies are in the executive branch, which means they both answer to the president, which means in theory that shouldn't happen. It should be that the president's setting the tone and telling his people, here's your mission, go out and do it. But that it doesn't actually work that way because the executive branch has gotten so huge and so complicated that the president actually can't oversee all of his agencies, can't oversee all the people who work underneath him, and couldn't even if he made that his sole mission because it's too big and too complicated. Hence you end up with interagency fights where they're supposed to be working together. And so, with respect to Pat's view of common good conservatism, most of the things he would advocate for, I'm probably in agreement with, saying, yeah, I want a society that's more virtuous. I want people that are more patriotic. But you put the government in charge of that, it's going to make a terrible mess of it because it just can't do things because it's way too big and way too complicated, way too messy, and completely unable to foresee and forestall unintended consequences. And I'll say the same thing to Dustin, where some of the goals that he wants, again, I'm sympathetic to, but it's the same problem. The government's way too big, way too inefficient, and way too messy to accomplish those things. Like the examples he cited of healthcare, Germany has a significantly smaller population than the U.S. does, and at least from my time I remember living in Germany, its population isn't near as diverse as the population of the U.S., hence the government there is going to have an easier time accomplishing things like healthcare, where our government is so big, so complicated, and it governs people who are so diverse. That's just, practically speaking, not really going to work here. At least they're going to have a very, very hard time making it work here. And that's one of the problems you see when people who are common good conservatives or of a more liberal persuasion like Dustin, I hope he doesn't mind me describing him that way, is they're appealing to all these other countries in the world and saying, see, they can do it there, they can do it there. But almost all the time, those countries have much smaller populations, and those populations are significantly less diverse. It doesn't work the same way in America. And the other reason for this problem is that when you go back and actually read the Constitution, read the Bill of Rights, and if you ever get the chance to go see the original copies of the original Constitution and Bill of Rights in Washington, D.C., go do that. You can actually still see John Adams' signature on some of those documents. It's really cool. But anyhow, go back and read those. Read some of the writings of the Founding Fathers. What should become immediately clear is that our government was actually not set up to work in the sense of being effective, efficient, competent, and dealing with problems. The whole goal of how our system of government was set up was to prevent the rise of tyranny. That's why there's all these checks and balances. That's why power is delegated out to the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. That's why things are slow and complicated. That's why you have a electoral college electing the president instead of a direct vote, but you have a direct vote electing congressmen, and at least initially you didn't have a direct vote electing senators. Power was delegated and broken up in all kinds of various different ways, with the idea being that we're going to balance all the rights and interests of everybody against everybody else, so that it'll be virtually impossible for any one person or institution or group to acquire all the power and become the ruling party. And here I don't mean ruling party in the sense of the Democrats are in office or the Republicans are in office. I mean ruling party like it was in the Soviet Union or is in North Korea or China or some of these other places where there is no other political party. At least with the Democrats and Republicans, you can vote for one other person. I mean, that's certainly better than single party rule. So when you look at these things, what I hope should be immediately clear is, first of all, our government was never designed with the intention of solving problems. If you want a government that exists only to solve problems, the best thing you can do is put a very, very small amount of people in charge and essentially give them all the power. Now, there's all kinds of good reasons you shouldn't do that, because they'll almost certainly become incredibly corrupt and it'll turn into a tyranny of some kind. But if that's all you're concerned with is, hey, efficient things that solve problems, that's going to solve problems a lot more quickly than our government will. And it was designed deliberately not to be that way, because the founding fathers and other people who started our country were far more concerned with preventing the rise of a tyranny than they were with having a government that's capable of giving you money or distributing public aid or running education or agricultural policy effectively. And secondly, and I find this problem to be systemic in every government agency, well, maybe not every, but virtually every government agency and institution I've ever looked into, is that it's now gotten so big and so complicated that it can't really accomplish what it wants to no matter what, because the more pieces something has, the easier it is to break, and there's so many pieces involved in government that it breaks all the time. So what I think from this then is that, generally speaking, our government is involved in a crap ton of things that it simply has no business being involved in, mostly because it isn't any good at it. It's not that it's like, say, immoral for us to have a Department of Education. It's that having the Department of Education is stupid because it doesn't work, it wastes a lot of time, resources, and money, and it would be better off if you just had the federal government completely out of education and left it as much as possible to local governments. Your county and city should have far more say in how education is done in your local area than the feds do. Now, since the feds distribute a bunch of money, really it's not that way, even though some people would like you to think it is. They have an immense amount of control over education because they're handing out money, and as soon as they hand out money, they can say, we gave you money, now you have to use it the way we think you should. So really, all the government should be doing is, in a sense, enforcing some basic laws and regulations that more or less everyone can agree on. Things like don't murder, don't steal, don't cheat, don't defraud people. Some reasonable extrapolations from that. I think you can make a good case that they should negotiate interstate commerce in that same sense, where one state can't cheat or defraud another, and if there's disputes as far as what's fair, then natural arbiter should be the federal government to step in and have some kind of laws or regulations governing that. They clearly need to have some kind of military protection for all of us, so that should be there too. You can make a good case that local governments, not the federal government, but local government should be involved in administering some type of public goods. These are things like street lamps, or in the case of the federal government, you could say the national park system, which is a wonderful thing. That's a type of public good. That's a type of thing that it's hard to see how it would exist without the government there creating it. So yeah, I think you could make a case that things like those, like the national parks, street lamps, roads, and things along those lines, infrastructure, some of that infrastructure anyway, it makes our society and our lives better, and it's often difficult to see how many of those things could exist without the government there, so you can make a case that the government should do some of those things. It also is necessary that the government has some type of criminal justice system and some type of punishment and law enforcement system. And if the feds are going to have rules and regulations that they enforce, then it naturally follows the federal government should have at least some type of law enforcement system. Now, I think they probably have way too many. You could probably simplify it down considerably and not have, like, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the FBI, and every single other federal law enforcement agency, but say like have one federal law enforcement agency and have them all, I don't know, you could have different departments in that if necessary, and that would simplify things and help things out. So basically that's essentially what I think the government should be in the business of doing. Some basic laws to help run society, the enforcement mechanisms that are necessary for those, which includes criminal justice systems and law enforcement officials, military, and some other type of civil judiciary for disputes on things along those lines. And locally speaking, you'd want some police and local government, things along those lines. But for the most part, what I think you should see immediately follows from this is I'm utterly convinced that probably 70 or 80% of what our national government does, it simply has no business doing. It's not that I'm have deep moral objections to the government having, say, the FCC or the SEC or the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Education. I don't. It's that, practically speaking, when you look at a lot of these things, they just don't work very well because they're so big and complicated. Although, to be fair, somebody told me recently that the SEC actually is pretty on top of things. They're just drastically undermanned and underfunded, which tells me, hey, maybe we should cut funding and resources from all these frivolous things that the government has no business doing, and if the SEC is really a good law enforcement agency that is really going after real crimes, put some of it there so it can actually do its job. Now, when I was talking to Dustin, he mentioned John Rawls' veil of ignorance test, the idea being that you want to form a society where it's as fair as possible for everybody, because if you're going into it with a veil of ignorance, you don't know in what position of society you're going to end up in. Well, as best as I can tell, this highly limited form of government, if it doesn't pass that test, it comes very, very close to passing it, at least as far as the government is concerned. Now, there may be other aspects of society that you can point to and say, well, that's not fair, that's not right. But for the most part, I would say probably most of those things, it's not the government's business to look into. The government is bad at doing these things, so society should look to other institutions to address those things. In fact, that's what I argued for in my essay on welfare and public aid, is we should be looking to private charities to fill this gap, because most of them are immensely better at doing that kind of thing than the federal government is. You give the private charities in America $20 trillion to work with, I would be shocked if there was any poverty in America in 5 years, unless it was somebody who had mental illness, a severe drug problem, or who didn't want to get out of poverty. One of those other issues that isn't actually caused by a lack of wealth. So if you've been following me on this, even if you don't agree, I hope you can see that it quite naturally follows that I don't really have a political home as far as a party that I can look to and go, yep, I like them, I'm with them all the way. Because the Democrats are always seeking to increase the government's power and reach. And the Republicans are always seeking to increase the government's power and reach. Now, where and how they're looking to do that, there are some differences there, but they're both always looking to increase the government's power and reach, and as best as I can tell, it's way too big and too complicated now and has too much reach and too much effect on our lives, and frankly should, most of the time, shut up and leave us all alone to live our lives, which it just can't seem to do, and which the politicians just can't seem to do. They're always trying to tell us what to do, when I think the correct moral thing is, unless I'm about to seriously hurt somebody else, the government just doesn't have any business telling me what to do. So, some of the other things that come up here, I mentioned several times in the previous episodes on political philosophy that the reality is a person's vote does have limited power, but I don't think that should make you despair and not vote. I think you should just recognize how limited your vote is, how limited other people's votes are, and then react accordingly, in part by, as I talked about at the start of this, not getting completely angry and bent out of shape just because somebody voted for somebody you don't like. The odds that their vote is going to be the deciding factor, very low. Even if their vote is the deciding factor, the odds that that particular politician is going to get to enact their agenda, given how the U.S. government is organized, very, very low. So gauge your emotions appropriately. But I do think one of the things that should encourage you to do that most people don't do is get very active and informed about your local politics, your local elections, because there your vote is significantly more effective than it is at the national level. So you should learn about who's running for your county government, your local city government, and so on and so forth, and really dig in deep and figure out who's going to be best there, because that's where your vote really has a substantial effect. Now, I am also very, very persuaded that the fact that we have two political parties who both want to increase the size of government, who have a monopoly on government, that's a very, very big problem. One of the ways that I see politics working in America is we want to try and balance the forces. So a good example of this is conservatives are typically thought of as the force that says we need to conserve what we have, and the liberals or progressives are the force that's saying, well, we need to think about changes. And if society has some type of a balance between those two, that's very, very good, because you can't throw out everything willy-nilly, because you have to have some sense of stability in your life, and that's the major good point in favor of being a conservative. At the same time, you can't hold on to tradition in the past just because it's tradition in the past. We need to be constantly examining things and figuring out, well, is this fair? Is this just? And that's the role of the political left or progressives, is to say, hey, aren't those slaves people too? Maybe we should free them and let them be vote and be full citizens in our society. Or, hey, aren't women people too? Shouldn't they vote? And when the political left is pushing like that, that's a very, very good thing, because it helps make society more just. At the very least, what it then requires of the conservatives, the traditional people, is you have to give an account, you have to give a justification for why that particular group of people is being excluded from normal society. And if, say, the progressive left was pushing to say, hey, we need to let serial killers be a regular part of society, well, it's very easy to give a good argument as to why those people shouldn't be a part of regular society. Now, one of the major problems that I am seeing in our society right now is that the political left is essentially pushed way, way, way too far and is saying things that are absolutely crazy and absolutely insane. Example of this is in one of the very early Democratic presidential primary debates. There was a candidate, I think he had served in President Obama's administration in like a cabinet post, who said that he wanted to allow transgender women, he wanted to have federal funds allocated for abortions for transgender women, which, and I might be mixing up the terms a little bit here, but the point was he wanted to allocate federal funds for abortions for a man who had surgery in order to physically appear as a woman and then started identifying as a woman. And I think he might have even said illegal immigrants who are in that category, and the audience applauded. Nobody at any point stopped and said, wait, that's insane. Transgender women by definition can't have children, because that's not how any of this works. So in the political left's desire, which at least in some sense is a good thing, to push and say, why are you excluding these people? They've pushed so far that they're now saying things that are patently insane and advocating for things that are patently insane. And for the most part, and I'll touch on this a little bit more later, the Democrats don't seem to be saying no to that. They seem to be saying, no, come on, more, give us more, push more, push more. It doesn't matter how crazy and insane this is, keep pushing more. So, getting back to the main point, the D's and R's have a monopoly on the political system in America right now, and that's a big problem, because they both basically operate with the same political theory, which is more government, the government exists to solve your problems. And that's wrong and stupid, and I hope that even if you don't agree with me on my political philosophy, you can see that there's something wrong with the fact that the two major parties are basically operating off of the same theory of government. There is no other theory of government that's prevalent in American politics right now. And there should be. There should be a challenge to them always trying to increase the size of government. There should be a challenge to the fact that our government operates on deficits and basically has for 20 or 30 years now and is unlikely to stop at this point. There should be somebody saying, wait. Maybe the government isn't the solution to these problems, and maybe we should stop trying to have the government solve all those problems. And practically speaking, it's unlikely that this is going to change, because The Ds and Rs have jerry-rigged the system in their favor through a whole host of reasons. The Commission on Presidential Debates has set it up so it's virtually impossible for a third-party candidate to ever get on stage, which makes it virtually impossible for them to win, and consequently it also makes it virtually impossible for there to be anybody to stand up to these people and go, wait, your ideas are stupid and don't work, and here's all the evidence, which is what we need. So in that vein, I encourage you and everybody else, if it's ever the case that you think a third-party candidate is a real good candidate, if you ever think the Libertarian Party candidate, the Green Party candidate, or whoever, or even independent, if you think they're a real good candidate, vote for them over the D or the R, because the more pushback there are on the Ds and Rs, probably the better our politics will get, because they have a monopoly on it right now, and that's not a good thing. There needs to be some kind of a force, some kind of a balance pushing back against them. When you, in American politics, the two parties are actually fundamentally opposed and have different ideas of government and how things should work, that can tend to work pretty well. It can have that balancing effect like the Founding Fathers intended. Right now, it's not the case. The Republicans claimed for years that they were this party of small government, but as best as I can tell, I'm 38 years old, the whole time I've been alive, they never have been. They've always increased the size of the government. At this point, it's not a question of who increases it, it's more a question of who's going to increase it more. And in that same vein, everybody always says third-party votes are throwing your votes away, but that's patently ridiculous. That just doesn't make any logical sense. When my liberal friends are telling me, hey, if you vote for the Libertarian candidate, that's a vote for Trump, and my conservative friends are telling me, hey, if you vote for the Libertarian candidate, that's a vote for Biden, well, that clearly cannot be the case. The same thing cannot have two opposite properties. That's logically incoherent. And so, what that tells you is, either one of them are wrong or they're both wrong. And the reality is they're both wrong. A vote for the Libertarian candidate is a vote for the Libertarian candidate. And if you think a third-party candidate or a write-in candidate or somebody like that is the best option, by all means vote for them. Probably one of the better things we could do in the near future to help solve politics in America is break this stranglehold that the Ds and Rs have on our electoral process. Even having it happen once or twice where an independent wins a major race or two or a third-party candidate wins a major race or two would probably scare them enough that it would start moving the Ds and Rs back to a reasonable, sensible view of these things. So I'm going on a little longer than I thought I would, so let me just move on to the practical issues involved here. Now, as I get into this, I think it's important that we be honest and admit that there is no candidate who isn't flawed. President Trump has flaws for multiple reasons, which I'll get into. But before him, President Obama ran drone strikes on American citizens without a trial, which in most cases would be considered a war crime. He also started a war in Libya without congressional approval of any kind, which, technically speaking, violates the Constitution. President Bush got us involved in Iraq in what became a quagmire, and maybe he had good intentions in doing that. He says he did. I haven't met him personally, but it was a very, very bad idea. It was a very bad mistake. It wasted all kinds of money, resources, and lives. President Clinton reportedly ignored the fact that Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden were gearing up to come and get us, and he also committed perjury by lying under oath about his affair with Monica Lewinsky. And yeah, we all make jokes about that, but perjury is a serious crime, and for the you can kind of say he got away with it, and you can kind of say he didn't, but the point being, he wasn't a terribly good president either. And even if you go back to some of my favorite presidents, like Lincoln, well, he was on record saying some things that are considered fairly racist, and if I remember correctly, he suspended the right of habeas corpus, which he should not have done. Jefferson is my favorite president as far as his political philosophy goes, but he was a pretty big jerk to a lot of people in his life who should have been his friends and owned slaves. So he isn't exactly a moral exemplar in many areas either. So the point being, as I go through pros and cons, everybody's going to have pros and cons. Some obviously you can look and say, well, I think the pros outweigh the cons. But the point being, if you're trying to say, yeah, my candidate is a saint and the other guy's the devil, no, they're not. You're wrong. That's stupid. You're being ideologically blind at that point. There's problems with Biden. There's problems with Trump. There's problems with Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian candidate. And you're going to be able to find that for every candidate. And so be honest enough to say, yeah, there has to be at least a few things about this guy that I don't like. Now, one more caveat before I get into this. I've often heard it said that Christians and evangelical Christians especially have really hurt their witness for Christ because so many of them support Trump, and I guess I should say us because I'm an evangelical Christian, although I didn't vote for Trump last time, so I don't know if it's fair to say I support him or not. But anyhow, the idea being that they were so against it when President Clinton had the affair and lied about it, etc., and displayed a lack of good moral character. But then President Trump has been very, very open and bragged about his many affairs and many of the horrible things he's done, and has really not acted Christ-like at all, at least before he got into office. And so there's the argument there essentially being that it's very hypocritical that Christians would be so against Clinton then, but now be pro-Trump. And I can kind of get that, I can kind of be sympathetic to it, but I also don't think that's a very, very fair reading of the situation. Because, as I mentioned earlier, I'd say probably 80 or 90% of the voting population in America has bought into the myth that you've only got two choices. You've got the D or the R, and that's it. Now, that's a myth, you shouldn't buy into it, but once you do, you've only got two choices. It's binary. So, put yourself in a evangelical Christian's shoes, even if you're not, and think about it this way. Who should you align yourself with if you've only got two choices? Should you align yourself with the people who are openly hostile to you, who call you xenophobic and bigoted because you think gay marriage is a bad idea, and who have made it very plain that in their view of society, there's no place for you or anyone like you? Or should you align yourself with the person who doesn't behave in ways that you like, but who says he wants to be your friend and ally? Well, I think the answer should be obvious. Trump says to evangelicals and Christians that he wants to be their friend and ally, even though he says a bunch of stupid things, he routinely curses, and he doesn't behave in Christ-like ways, but he's saying to evangelical Christians, hey, I want to be your friend, I want to be your ally, where the Democrats and the Democrats' allies are saying to evangelical Christians, you people are awful, terrible, and we want nothing to do with you. Well, what are evangelical Christians supposed to do then? The only way out is for them to not buy into the myth that you have to vote for the D or the R, like I keep telling people to do. So I don't think that's a really fair reading of the situation. American politics thrives on the idea that you've only got two choices, and when one choice openly says, we hate you and we're hostile to you, and the other choice says, hey, I want to be your friend, well, what are they supposed to do? I mean, should they shake hands with the person waiting to knife them in the back? Or should they shake hands with the person who maybe they don't like, but who says, come on, man, I want to be your friend? Okay, so on to the practical effects. So here's, as I see it, the pros for Trump. I think he's very, very good on foreign policy. Almost as soon as he got into office, he unleashed the U.S. military on ISIS, and they destroyed it. ISIS doesn't even seem to exist anymore. That happened. ISIS arose in large part because of the failures of President Obama's foreign policy and how he left a power vacuum, but now that's not really a problem anymore thanks to President Trump. President Trump brought about peace deals between Israel and I forget if it's 2 or 3 other Arab countries that until recently didn't even acknowledge the existence of Israel. That's astonishing. That's the kind of thing that people were saying would never happen, and it did. President Trump seems to have brought us back from the brink of war with Iran a couple of times by saying, well, I don't really want to do this. He seems to have managed to de-escalate the situation with North Korea such that we're not on the verge of war with them anymore. And again, that's all a good thing. He seems to at least be attempting to do something about Russia and China's ambitions and how they're, generally speaking, bad actors on the world stage and attempting to do stuff about it. President Trump is essentially, although he doesn't do it very well, saying no to the radical left. As I mentioned before, it seems to me the political left in this country is completely out of control and has absolutely lost their minds. And President Trump is mostly saying no to them. He's telling governors and people around the country, you need to stop the rioting. You need to rein in Antifa and protests where they loot, burn, and murder people. Even though many of them aren't, he's saying that's what needs to happen, and this ties into with another thing that I'll get to in just a little bit. And he also issued an executive order saying we're not going to do any kind of sensitivity training in the U.S. government based on critical race theory anymore. And critical race theory is, loosely speaking, a very bad and illogical and irrational idea that everyone is always racist. And so that's a terrible, terrible way to look at the world. And for him to come in and say, no, that's not right, that's wrong, we shouldn't be doing any kind of sensitivity training based on these types of things because that actually is racist. Well, he's right about that. Now, when he talked about that in the debate, he said it in a very foolish way because he's President Trump and he can't seem to say things in any kind of a good way. But he's right about that. That's a very anti-American and anti-moral idea that actually is itself racist that we should all be resisting. Now, this one is both a pro and a con, but President Trump seems to be a bit of a pragmatist. And what I mean by that is he seems to take the political positions that he thinks are advantageous to him. And that can be both a pro and a con, because if it's I'm going to stick my finger in the wind and go where the wind blows types of politician, that's a bad thing. If it's a pragmatist in the sense of, well, I'll cut some deals and get things done, that's kind of a good thing. And I can see maybe in a sense both of those tendencies in President Trump. So that's kind of a wash there. So now this one I think is a very big pro in that he's not from the political class. Although since he's been president for 4 years, he's now a politician. But at least when he started running, he wasn't that way. He was an outsider. And if he was a little bit better at speaking and articulating things and didn't often say things in such a dumb way, that could be a very, very good thing, because I think part of the reason why there's been so many shakeups in the White House staff and so many people quitting and leaving is he's not a typical politician. So he comes in and they say, well, Mr. President, this is what we're going to do. And he's like, why? Why are we doing it that way? Where a typical politician would just say, okay, because that's the way it's always been done. President Trump is actually, I think, questioning a lot of the assumptions that go into how our government runs and making people justify to him why they do things that way. I think that's maybe part of the reason why we didn't get into a war with Iran, is the military wanted to do responses, and he said, well, these responses don't seem very proportionate. And I don't think a typical politician would have said that. But President Trump, not being a typical politician, did say that, and that probably prevented us from being in a war with Iran, which is a very good thing. Now, this one is a very odd and unusual type of pro that I think only probably could apply to President Trump, but that is, he typically does not follow through on the very, very crazy and often stupid and dumb things he says. Like, he's called CNN and the media before the enemy of the people. That's stupid. He shouldn't do that. But he hasn't attempted to shut down any media sources or organizations. He hasn't put journalists in jail. He hasn't killed people for saying the wrong things about him. In a sense, all that he's done to suppress the press, like the press like to complain about, is he said some mean and stupid and often true things about them. Likewise, as I think I've mentioned before, one of the main reasons I didn't vote for him last time around is he said in the debates leading up to the presidential election that he would order U.S. troops to commit war crimes. Well, again, as best as I can tell, not only has he not done that, but he's been significantly less hawkish than most other politicians and most other Republicans have been. So yeah, he says a lot of very stupid garbage, but as best as I can tell, most of the stupid garbage he says, he just doesn't follow through on. It's just him saying stupid garbage. Now, that isn't something a president should do, so that is a big con to put in. In fact, under my con list, one of them is just Twitter, which is self-explanatory, and that he's very, very uncareful in the way that he speaks. And so I think that's definitely a big con, because that's not something you should want in your president. But at the same time, I think you can say it's kind of a pro in that when you look at what he actually does, it's not as crazy and stupid as the things he says. And now this last pro here is a very big one in my estimation, due to how my theory of government, how my political philosophy works, which is, it actually seems to me that very often, and again I think this is in part because he's not a typical politician, President Trump has actually resisted expanding the power of the federal government. And what I mean by that is, There is legal precedent and legal ways where President Trump could have invoked the Insurrection Act and sent in federal troops to the U.S. cities that have been experiencing ongoing riots, some of them which are still ongoing, for the last 5 or so months, give or take, depending on how you want to date all this stuff. But for the most part, he hasn't done that. Now, he's called on governors and mayors to do that. He said, hey, if you invite me in, I'm going to give you resources. But he seems to more or less kind of recognize, I'm the head of the federal government. It's the state's government and the local city or county government's responsibility to be the first line of defense against things like rioters and burning of down city blocks and things like that. And even if they're not doing their job, as clearly many of them haven't been, it should not be the case that the first thing that happens is the feds run in and assume control. And so while he's talked about doing that, for the most part, as best as I can tell, he hasn't. I think he's sent federal forces that in his reinforcements to areas that are federal properties. I think he has sent in federal forces as assistance and backup at places where they've been asked for. But for the most part, he hasn't just said, we're going to run in and assume control with the feds. And it's the same thing with the coronavirus pandemic. There is probably no greater opportunity for the federal government to just assume all kinds of power than since the Second World War. And yet it seems like that for the most part, President Trump has resisted doing that. And I don't think any other politician would have. I think that any other politician, Republican or Democrat, would have used this to probably set up a whole new cabinet position in his government, as President Bush did after 9/11 with the Department of Homeland Security, which is mostly a giant fiasco. And so I view that as a very, very, very good thing, because the less power that the federal government has, since it's already way too powerful, the better. And it seems like President Trump just really isn't very interested in expanding the power of the federal government, because there's been ample opportunity where he could have done that, and he hasn't. Now, I don't think that's because President Trump shares my political philosophy. I'm more inclined to think that's because he's a political outsider who's like, well, why would we do that? And people have a hard time giving him a good answer for that, and so he doesn't do it. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it does really seem to me that he's resisted expanding the power of the federal government, and I really like that. That seems very, very good to me. And the final good point I'll make here is that despite what Dustin said in the exchange I had with him, I do think President Trump's economic policies have been very, very good. I found out later that the two financial institutions that Dustin quoted as saying, hey, Biden's going to be better, they work off of Keynesian economics, which is an economic model that says, hey, the more money the government takes in and the more regulations there are, the better the economy is going to be. So, of course, they're going to look at Biden and say he's going to be better. That's how their economic models work. I think those economic models are garbage, and I think history and a little bit of common sense shows us they're garbage, because the more regulated a society is, and the more money the government pulls in, the slower and less economic growth it has. Just look around the world and you tend to see that. Now, there's, of course, variance because it's not like regulation and government taxes are the only indicators of economic growth, and they're the only things that affect them. There's lots of other things that come into play too. But as a general rule, increasing those things is usually not a good idea. And likewise, it doesn't seem to me at this point that we can look and say, well, this is still President Obama's economy, and President Trump has little to nothing to do with it. The best we can say is he didn't muck it up. Now, I think you could have maybe made a case like that during, say, the first year that President Trump was in office, maybe the first year and a half or two, because it is fair to say economic policies take a while to take effect. It's not like you cut taxes and suddenly 30 new businesses open their door. You cut taxes and maybe 30 new people want to go out and start a business. Well, that's going to take them a little while to start their business. It's going to take a while for those businesses to start making a profit, and so on it goes. So there is a bit of a lag there. But at this point, we're 4 years into President Trump's presidency, so it just doesn't make sense to me to say, no, this is still President Obama's economy. I mean, by that logic, when President Obama was claiming credit for his accomplishments, we should have been saying, no, you're reaping the whirlwind of things that Bush did. And now it's fair to object to that and say, hey, the president maybe doesn't have a lot of control over the economy, and that I think that might actually be true, that we tend to over-attribute the power of economics to the president. But you do have to have some kind of a consistent standard. So that's the consistent standard I'm trying to have, is say, president's been in office only a year, yeah, maybe you can turn around and say, that's the other guy. At 2 years, it's a little less certain, but by the time you're at 3 or 4 years, it's pretty much President Trump's economy at that point. So, cons of President Trump. Well, as I said, he seems to be a pragmatist, and that can be a problem if it's a stick your finger in the wind type of pragmatist, or you don't have any principles you operate off of. Now, it doesn't seem to me that President Trump is that type of pragmatist. It seems to me more like, I think when he started running for president, he selected the items that he thought would get him elected, like immigration and so on and so forth, and he's more or less tried to do those since he got in office. It doesn't seem to me like he's changed his mind on major policy positions and his major ideas after he got into office. And of course, the obvious cons in that President Trump often says very dumb and very stupid things, and he's very uncareful in how he speaks, and he should not be on Twitter at all because it's just terrible and embarrassing for the U.S. in every way that our president says those awful things on Twitter. That's awful. I think it probably is a con as well that you can look at President Trump and say that he's displayed some very narcissistic behavior, because he certainly has. I remember an interview I think did with, I want to say it was Frank Luntz, up to his first election, where he said that he's never asked God for forgiveness because he's never done anything he's sorry for. That's terrible. Now, he also has some of the typical bad things that come with Republicans, because the Republicans are far from a perfect political party, so there's bad things that come with that. The national debt has exploded even worse under President Trump than it has under anybody else, and that's not a good thing. It shouldn't be the case that we have these huge deficits every year, and President Trump seems to be making that worse, even though I believe he said in his campaign that he wanted to make that better, but he certainly hasn't. So, as I see it, it seems to me that the biggest con with President Trump is that he has this very abrasive personality, and that he speaks and acts in very stupid and uncareful ways. But his biggest pro is that he's not from the political class. He's resisted expanding the power of the federal government, and that I do think, for the most part, his economic and foreign policies have been very, very good, and we've seen a lot of good effects from that. So, what about Joe Biden? Well, it seems to me, for pros, he's not President Trump. And I think that's why a lot of people are voting for him, is that he's not President Trump. Now, by that, I also mean he doesn't have the same gruff, aggressive personality as President Trump does. Now, Joe Biden is not, I would say, very, very careful in how he speaks either, but it's not in the same way of President Trump. Joe Biden has been described as a gaffe machine by people who are political pundits and people who follow politics, and that's fair. He makes mistakes all the time. But when President Trump says things, he's usually not making a mistake. He's usually saying to you exactly what he thinks, where Biden is often, I think, making mistakes. Now, I would actually also say that some of those verbal gaffes he makes are funny. I would actually rate them as a pro. When President Obama was running for re-election back in 2012, I think I put something up on Facebook along the lines of, look, President Obama can secure my vote if he does one of two things. Assure me that Joe Biden will be the vice president again, and make sure Joe Biden gives daily speeches that are publicly available on anything Joe Biden wants to talk about, because he's so hilarious to listen to. And I wasn't saying that to be mean. I genuinely find him to be a funny guy. Now, also, you can look at this as a pro, although it could also be a con. Joe Biden has lots of political experience. He's been in the government for, I think, 46 or 47 years. So he's been around Washington. He knows everybody involved. He knows how things typically work. It's not going to be the case that when he's president and they come to him and say, Mr. President, this is what we need to do, he's going to look at them oddly and go, why are we doing it that way? Because he knows that's how things are done. And it is a it would be a pro to have a president who isn't saying stupid things on Twitter and genuinely seems like he's a nice and decent person. So, moving on to Joe Biden's cons. Well, it seems to me one of his big cons is he's not saying no to the extreme left. The extreme left in this country is out of control. Antifa is killing people. Antifa is burning cities. Antifa is assaulting federal courthouses. And he says Antifa is just an idea. He's surrounded himself basically with people who are from the extreme left. Bernie Sanders helped write the new Democratic platform and bragged about it and has claimed that Joe Biden will be the most progressive president the country's ever seen. Now, to people who are on the political left, that might sound like a good thing, but to me that sounds like a terrible thing, because progressivism used to be a humanist philosophy. It used to be the idea that, come on in, there's room for all. It used to be them essentially pushing back against the right and saying, why are you excluding women? Why are you letting people into your ranks who are racist and want to exclude black people? Why can't the gay people get married? And even though I don't agree with them on gay people getting married, it used to be the idea of we need to be a big tent country, a big tent society where there's room for all, at least everybody that we can possibly let in. And that's a very humanist philosophy, and even where I would disagree on points, like in the example of gay marriage, that's something that I could generally get behind. But progressivism isn't like that anymore. Now it's extremely authoritarian. Progressivism now is, if you don't like us, you need to shut up, get out of the way, and we're going to make you do it whether you like it or not. It's no longer, hey, let the gay people get married and they'll leave you alone and you'll leave them alone. Now it's, how dare you not be celebrating gay marriage? It's the greatest thing that's ever happened, and if you don't celebrate it with us, you're a bigot. And as best as I can tell, in the way he's campaigned and the way he's talked about it, Joe Biden doesn't actually say those authoritarian things, but when people question him about the people in the Democratic Party who are like that, and the people who have those tendencies, he doesn't reject it, he denies that it's even there, which tells me he's either in a bubble and blind to what's going on, or he thinks he needs those people and doesn't want to alienate them, even though they're clearly doing and saying very wrong and very anti-American things. Authoritarianism, in the sense of my way or the highway, is a very anti-American philosophy. You could make a very good case that humanism, in the sense of we want a big tent society that includes as many people as possible, is a very American philosophy. But progressivism, unfortunately, has moved from a humanistic philosophy into an authoritarian philosophy. And that is not something we should get behind. You do not want an authoritarian government ruling over you, and you don't want somebody who's allied with authoritarians governing over you, because that's probably not going to end well. Now, I don't say this next one to be mean, but I think it is something that you really do need to take into account, which is that it really does seem like Joe Biden is starting to decline with his age. We all saw him for 8 years when he was vice president, and he seems to be declining with age. He seems to be kind of losing his grip on things, and I don't mean he's like completely disconnected from reality, but he has a lot harder time finding words. He says things that don't make sense very often now, and really that's just kind of sad. I don't like that, because it's sad to see somebody declining with age. It's going to happen to probably most of us with time, but it's not a good thing, and I'm not pleased by that, because as I said, I used to find Joe Biden very, very funny in the way he would talk. It was hilarious, and I enjoyed listening to him. Now it's actually just kind of sad, and I feel bad for him. But the effect of that is, if Joe Biden's president, there's a pretty decent chance he's probably not going to be actually running the country. It'll probably be Kamala Harris or Joe Biden's handlers. And if he is incapacitated, it'll definitely be Kamala Harris, so that's something you need to think about as well. And I don't view a Kamala Harris presidency as a good thing, because when I talked about those authoritarians on the political left, she's one of the prime examples. She's proven herself over and over again to be a very, for lack of a better term, Machiavellian politician who will just do and say whatever she thinks will get her ahead. I don't think that's necessarily as true of Joe Biden. I think that guy may actually have some principles that he tries to adhere to, although not as many as I would like, and probably more loosely. But I see virtually no evidence with Kamala Harris that she has any principles at all she adheres to, other than I'm going to do and say whatever it takes to get me ahead. And if you don't believe me, look into her history as to how she started her career in politics. It demonstrates that pretty well. Now, it can also be considered a con that Joe Biden's been in politics for 40 some odd years. How can it be the case that this guy who's been in politics for 7 some odd years, I forget the exact number, is now turning around saying, yeah, we've got all these problems in the country, we've got systematic racism in the country, and now I'm ready to start fixing it, after I've been in office for 47 years. That's, to me, is a sign that he probably isn't really going to do that. Maybe it's because he's not capable of doing it, maybe it's because nobody's capable of doing it. But as Joe Biden would say, come on, man. You've been at this for 46 years, and now you're finally ready to start solving problems? Now, another con here, from my theory of government anyway, is it really seems to me very likely, based on the actions we've seen of President Trump, that Joe Biden would probably increase the federal government's reach and power much faster than President Trump would. Probably much faster than a typical Republican would, but definitely much more than President Trump would, because, as I've said before, President Trump just seems to be resisting expanding the power of the feds, where Joe Biden is talking about doing all these things for the federal government. In that same vein, it seems to me that one of the things that Biden tries to bring up as to how he would be a better president than Trump is the government's response to the COVID pandemic. But he, I think, would definitely increase the reach of the federal government there, and I'm pretty skeptical of that. It also seems, from what I've looked at, that his so-called plan isn't really any different than what President Trump already did, and he would probably try and get everybody locked down again, which might, in some sense, delay the onset of the virus for some people, but it would probably cause even more of an economic meltdown. In that same vein, I think it's fair to say at this point that the Democratic Party, despite its claims, is not the party of science. Biden actually said at one point, and based on how he said this, and the way he said it, I don't think it was a verbal gaffe where he was just making a dumb mistake, but he actually said that President Trump is responsible for all of the 220-some-odd thousand people that have died of COVID, which, if you even think about it somewhat rationally, that's absolutely ridiculous. President Trump didn't start the virus. Even if you think he did bungle the government's response to the COVID pandemic, it's absolutely insane to say he's responsible for every single one of those deaths. You might be able to make an argument that, hey, if he'd acted better in this way, 10,000 people here might have survived, or maybe 100,000 people here might have survived. But the idea of saying every single one of those deaths is on President Trump because he didn't act the right way is really dumb. People were going to die of the COVID pandemic no matter what the government did at that point. There's no way that any human institution could have prevented every single one of those deaths, except for maybe China, because China's responsible for the virus. In the vice presidential debate, Kamala Harris said that she wouldn't take a vaccine if it was developed while Donald Trump was president, or excuse me, if it was put out while Donald Trump was still president. That's anti-scientific. And Mike Pence rightly called her out on it and said, you shouldn't do that. The governors of California and New York, who are both Democrats, in fact, have said that they're going to appoint their own commissions to make sure whatever vaccine the FDA puts out is safe, i.e., they're saying, we don't trust the federal government. Now, President Trump is in no way developing a vaccine himself. It's various doctors and researchers who are working independently at some pharmaceutical companies, and the FDA is overseeing that. So for the Democrats to say this kind of thing is really stupid. It tells me these people aren't the party of science like they claim they are. They're just trying to use we're the party of science as a talking point to get people to vote for them, when they really don't care at all about science, or they wouldn't be saying such stupid things like that. Now, at the same time, Joe Biden has been in politics long enough that we have a record of what he's thought about foreign policy for the last 40 or so years, and President Obama's own defense secretary, Robert Gates, said of Joe Biden that he's been wrong on every foreign policy decision in his political life. So, just to run through a few of them, Joe Biden voted against the first Gulf War that the first President Bush initiated, which, by most accounts, that war actually seemed to go pretty well and probably prevented a big massacre in Kuwait. Joe Biden then voted for the second war in Iraq, which we all know in hindsight was a very bad idea, and then reversed himself later when it became popular to say that he was against the war in Iraq, even though he voted for it. When he was vice president, he actually advocated that President Obama not authorize the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, which, that's just bizarre. How could you not? That's like the easiest policy, that's like the easiest judgment call that any president would have ever had as a president. The only big risk there is, what if the raid fails? Even back at the start of this year, Joe Biden was saying that it was xenophobic for President Trump to suspend all travel to and from China when the pandemic started raging. So he's just been wrong on foreign policy, where it seems to me that President Trump is very, very right on foreign policy. So on to probably the only major third-party candidate, Jo Jorgensen, who's running as a Libertarian candidate for president. So in my book, pros are, well, she's running as a Libertarian, so she probably aligns a bit more closely with me. She would probably have less or smaller government. Another pro, a bit like Trump there when he first got started, is she's not from the political class. And she's also significantly more educated than both President Trump and Joe Biden. I forget exactly what her degree is in, but she worked as either, I think, a professional psychologist or a professional psychiatrist or something along those lines. But she's more educated than both of them. But cons, it seems to me, well, she won't say no to the extreme left either. In fact, she's embracing it. Unlike Joe Biden, who's just kind of blinking his eyes and pretending it's not there, she's going to these rallies where people are chanting that America is systematically racist. And in my mind, that's a big check against her, because that's the kind of garbage that we need to be resisting. Not to say that, like, racism is good, racism is evil. But if you're talking about these critical race theories that say that everyone is racist, well, no, those are wrong and horrifically wrong, and they're immoral and racist themselves, so I don't want anything to do with those. She also has said that she supports abortion. Now, I didn't mention that with regards to President Trump and Joe Biden, because that's baked into the cake when you're talking about Democrats and Republicans. And also, look into some details on who the Libertarians selected as a running mate, and he seems kind of insane. So it seems to me that, even though I call myself a small-L libertarian and I did vote for Gary Johnson in the 2016 election, that Jorgensen's just out. She's disqualified by the fact that she's embracing this extreme left stuff, and that she's supporting abortion, and that her running mate is insane, because even though she doesn't seem insane, it's very irresponsible to pick a vice president who's insane. And in the same vein, I think that's a big check mark against Biden, because they try and present him as this, like, he's going to be this moderate Democrat who's a bulwark against the political left. But look who he selected as his vice president. She's been rated by many organizations as the most liberal senator in the United States, even more so than Bernie Sanders. So that tells me, no, he's not a bulwark against the extreme left. He's just trying to use them to get into political power. Now, why he wants political power, who knows? I can't presume to speculate on that. But the idea that he's going to be a moderate Democrat, I just can't see that. If it was Joe Biden of 30 or 40 years ago, maybe, but the Democratic Party was actually sensible and not extreme and irrational then, like it has become now. The Democratic Party seems to me to have gone completely insane in the last 3 or 4 years after President Trump beat Hillary Clinton, and that's a shame, because they could have been a nice and wise counter to President Trump, but that's not how it's turned out. They've just basically gone insane. So this has all gone on much, much longer than I think it should have. I'm sorry, but there's just so much to go through, so many details, so much material, and I've actually missed many things I wanted to say. But I'll wrap up here by telling you what I think you should do. Here's what I think you should do. I think you should under no circumstances vote for Joe Biden or for Jo Jorgensen, because I think one of the most important things we could do right now is not enable the extreme political left in this country, because it's out of control, and it will do great damage and will hurt a lot of people and will cause damage to our government, our culture, and our institutions. And there doesn't seem to be any good reason to think that Joe Biden's going to say no to them. President Trump clearly doesn't understand these things very well, but he is saying no to them. Now, I don't think necessarily it follows from that you should vote for President Trump. I'm very, very tempted to do so because he does seem to have displayed, as I talked about, a resistance to expanding the power of the federal government, and that's a real strong checkmark in his favor. Now, I know it would be hard for many people to get to actually voting for him because his personality is so abrasive and he says so many dumb things, and it is embarrassing to have a president who says all these dumb things on Twitter. But I think when you do look at his policies, kind of similar to what Pat said, a lot of them are, for the most part, pretty good. It seemed like the country was on the right track, or at least getting close to being on the right track, before the COVID pandemic came and knocked everything down. So here's what I think you should do. I think you should either vote for President Trump, or you should write somebody in like a Dan Crenshaw or a Tulsi Gabbard. Both Dan Crenshaw and Tulsi Gabbard got nominated as the Unity Party candidates. The Unity Party is something that got started up this year. Unfortunately, it's too late to make any difference, but it is a very good idea of saying, hey, let's work together on the things where we can find common ground. And realistically, look into who Dan Crenshaw is and who Tulsi Gabbard is. Crenshaw's a Republican, Gabbard's a Democrat. Crenshaw's from Texas. I think, if I remember right, Gabbard's from Hawaii. They're both military veterans. I forget exactly what Gabbard did while she was in the military, but I think she was an officer. I think she got up to major or lieutenant colonel. And Crenshaw was a Navy SEAL who got injured and is now in Congress. They're both in Congress. Anyhow, either of them would probably be a fine president from what I know about them, and I would be happy with either of them as president. Either of them would probably be a better president than either Trump or Biden, and I'd be happy with voting for them. So what I'm probably going to end up doing is either writing in Dan Crenshaw or voting for President Trump, or maybe writing in Gabbard. And that's what I think you should do. I think it would probably be a very, very bad thing if Joe Biden was president, because I think it would enable all the worst elements that we're seeing from the political left, which is trying to rear its head right now. And I think he probably would dramatically increase the reach of the federal government. So that's what I think. But at the same time, like I said at the beginning, I am very, very convinced that even if Joe Biden becomes the president, and even if he dies in office and Kamala Harris becomes the president, I think at the end of that, your rights as an American citizen are still going to be intact. I think you're still going to be able to go to the church you want to and worship how you want to. I think you're still going to be able to work at the job you want to. I think you're still going to be able to, for the most part, live your life as you want to, because your rights as an American citizen are not dependent on who's president. And despite everybody claiming every 4 years that, hey, this president's going to ruin everything if you don't get it right, it hasn't happened. And I don't think it's going to happen this time. But that's who I think you should vote for. So that's going to be the end of my political philosophy podcast, since the election's coming up just a couple days after this gets out. By all means, write in, let me know what you think. Tell me what your political philosophy is. Tell me which one of the guests I had on you agreed with the most. Tell me where you think I've gone wrong, if you think I have gone wrong. Or better yet, tell me why you agree with me and why I'm right. You can always reach me for any kind of comment at the Examine Life with Phil at gmail.com. Do a search for the Facebook page. Just type in the Examine Life with Phil, and I post stuff there. And I will be back with something else in 2 weeks' time. I'm going to go back to the bi-weekly schedule now that the election's over and I don't have to push and rush all this stuff out to get you guys thinking about political philosophy before you go vote. So, thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you again in 2 weeks' time.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.